This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. A big thanks goes out to our many-time guest, Josh Cohen, host of the Eyewitness History Podcast. Links to learn more can be found at eyewitnesshistory.com or in the show notes. Did you know you can support the Beyond the Big Screen podcast two great ways? One is by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen. Also is a great way to support us is by leaving those ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts. Now, we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Josh Cohen's Eyewitness History. You can learn more about Parthenon Podcast Network by going over to parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, movies and stories so great they should be movies by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all of this and more can be found at our website. And I thank you again for joining me Beyond the Big Screen. I'd like to welcome back Josh Cohen, host of Eyewitness History Podcast. Josh has joined us to talk about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and The Hateful Eight, and we continue our study of Quentin Tarantino with the 2012 film Django Unchained. Are you ready for this one, Josh?
I sure am, Steve. Thank you so much for having me back. I love this movie. This may actually be my favorite Quentin Tarantino movie, so can't wait to chat about it.
Now, Django Unchained is a re-envisioned and reimagined spaghetti western set 2 years before the beginning of the U.S. Civil War. The movie stars Jamie Foxx as the title character Django. The film also features a masterful performance by Leonardo DiCaprio as Monsieur Calvin Candy, as well as some Quentin Tarantino alumni of Samuel L. Jackson, as well as Christoph Waltz and Kerry Washington. Masterful performances by all of these actors. The fact is that a couple of actors, and we'll get into this, I almost completely blew the water out of people who were giving masterful performances. And then a couple of the actors just gave performances that were exponentially beyond that. I guess to start off today, one thing that anybody watching this film, you have to be, if you're going to watch a Quentin Tarantino movie, you have to be comfortable with a use of some very rich language, you might say, and violence. And this movie really has plenty of both of those elements. As usual, I suggest you watch the movie, listen to our podcast, then go back and watch the movie. But definitely be aware that this language and violence are key figures in this movie. I guess the big thing to tackle up front maybe is the use of the N-word, because that was very controversial, but a big part of the movie. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I know Tarantino he's been generating controversy, well, of all kinds, pretty much his whole career, but specifically on the use of the N-word since Reservoir Dogs. And I remember back after Pulp Fiction came out in 1992, Spike Lee came out very upset with Tarantino for his use of the word. And I could understand why. In Pulp Fiction, the use of the word didn't really have a place as far as the theme. It didn't have to get used, but Tarantino chose to use it. Now, being the free speech guy that I am, and storytellers should be able to tell the stories any way that they want, I'll back Tarantino on that. Here, actually, I think the story it's essential to telling a true story of that horrible period, because this was part of their dialect, part of their rhetoric. These were the words that they would have used. So as far as I'm concerned, it's simply just a case of sticking to realism.
I also wonder, and I wonder what you think about this. It seemed like it was used, probably turned up to 11. Do you think he was trying to make a point to having it used so much in the movie?
I can definitely understand why people would think that. There's certain scenes where he could use it once or twice and get the point across, but he seems to, as you say, dial up to 11. May in fact have used it 11 times in a given scene. It could well be possible. I mean, I do think controversy tends to find Tarantino. There's always someone to complain about, the use of violence against women, for instance, which we covered in the last podcast on the Hateful Eight. But I think oftentimes he finds the controversy himself. I do think he's, to use a word, more liberal with the N-word than he really needed to be. But I understand why he wanted to do it, because I think part of it is, I think in terms of you're an the master value for Tarantino when he's directing a film is, how is it going to make the audience member feel? You and me, kind evolved people as we are, we hear the N-word and it's a gut punch, right? We are uncomfortable. We do not like it. It seems to me that, and I don't know anyone who was not that way, by the way. It seems to me that every time the word gets used in Django, that's the effect he's trying to get from the audience member. He's trying to make us wrench and make us feel uncomfortable. There's a bit of a quandary creeping up here because everyone in the movie uses it. What I was going to say was the bad people use the bad word, and that's how I know they're bad, and it's sort of like a marker. But that's not true. I mean, the kindest person in the film, Dr. Kane Schultz, played, as you point out, masterfully by Christoph Waltz, uses the term with abandon, as does everyone else.
We've talked about that. So let's talk about the violence factor. We talked about the Hateful Eight and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. They were violent enough, for sure. But this, again, seems to take the violence to a whole new level. How would you think that compares to some of his Quentin Tarantino's earlier works?
Some of his earlier work, I would say it's definitely a step up from his earlier work, with a possible exception of Kill Bill. I think personally, probably the most violent scene Tarantino ever shot was the first Kill Bill episode, the first Kill Bill movie. He bumps it up, and I think I can guess why. And I think some of the background of the film, it was, I think, 1964, there was a spaghetti Western movie called Django, which starred Franco Nero, who has a cameo in this film. And when it came out, it was well known for being one of the most violent movies ever made up to that time. And this movie, obviously, in some degree, is a homage to that. So I suspect Tarantino imported or assimilated that spaghetti Western element into the movie. But also, violence is one of Tarantino's main businesses on top of dialogue. So, yeah, that'd be my summary of it.
I think that this movie, it really is the pure homage to the spaghetti Western. And we've talked in the past how Quentin Tarantino really plays with genre. Right. Did he bring in any other genres that you could see?
Yeah. Well, Tarantino has been playing with this idea of historical fiction since Inglourious Bastards. I know, obviously, we covered it in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, for instance, which also has a lot of the same themes that we see in Django. The idea of it's, in many ways, it's a buddy film. Christoph Waltz and Jamie Foxx, who I think had wonderful chemistry. It's a romance, certainly. Django retrieving his Brumhilde. And then also it's a revenge fantasy in many ways. I didn't think seeing Django whip a slave master would bring me such joy, but it did.
Going on into some of the elements of the movie, because you said that it's possibly your favorite Tarantino movie, of a person who really loves Tarantino movies. What do you think separates this from some of the other films?
Well, we were talking a bit offline before we came on, Steve, about what a big fan of Leonardo DiCaprio I am. I've been a fan of his for a long time. I mean, I'm talking since What's Eating Gilbert Grape. And this is the first movie he's been in however long, 20 years, where he hasn't played a lead role. So that was interesting to me. And then the fact that it is one of my favorite actors working under one of my favorite director, meant a lot for me. So I was most excited to see this film relative to the other ones because of his presence there. But also, if you watch the previews, it feels kind of esoteric. You don't really quite know what to make of it. Like, you see, okay, it's a slave movie, and you can see that. Wait a minute, there's a German guy, and Jamie Foxx has a gun. There's a lot of, for me anyway, there were a lot of disparate pieces that I was really anxious to put together and see how it came out. And a quick fun fact here is it still is the highest grossing film of Tarantino's career. It's made something like, I think, $480 million across I think it was $100 million budget.
For me, a big part of the movie was that I think you had to really understand the spaghetti Western genre to get this movie. For me, when I watched it in my first blush, because I'm kind of going into these movies. I've seen some of the earlier Quentin Tarantino movies, but I haven't seen some of these later ones. And looking at it, I found it was hard to understand for me where the movie was really going and what bigger point it was trying to make besides the revenge point. And even the revenge point, I kind of found that I didn't understand the final revenge against Candy, because Candy's a jerk and he's a slave owner, but he really wasn't he wasn't the person who sold Django and separated him and his wife Brunhilde. He's kind of ancillary to it, and you're not really sad to see any of the people killed, but it really wasn't the person who we would really want to see getting revenge against.
Yeah, I mean, taking that a step further, if the movie was written to that specification, then we would have seen Jamie Foxx and Kerry Washington going back to the Cruakin plantation, which has it was Old Man Cruakin, played by Bruce Dern, who only has one scene in the movie in the form of a flashback scene. And yes, if we were going to go after the personal revenge part of the movie, that's where they would have gone. So I think back to what it could have been that they went to Candyland, as you point out, very ancillary character. It really could have been anyone, right? It didn't have to be Calvin Candy. Could have been anybody. Could have been who was the businessman? Don Johnson's character.
Big Daddy.
Yes, thank you, sir. It could have been Big Daddy, or it could have been anyone. So my suspicion is that's just a good old-fashioned representation of institutional structural power, because Calvin Candy, in his way, is also sort of an archetypal, stereotypical Southern figure. He's the powerful Southern white man, obviously, who is a fraud in every conceivable way. You'll recall that he's a Francophile, prefers Monsieur Candy to Mr. Candy, doesn't speak a lick of French, right? And fancies himself as a cultured man, right? Has the library, but doesn't know that Alexander Dumas is black. As
I don't think he even knew who Alexander Dumas was.
No, he probably didn't. So sorry to drone on, Steve, but then just the last point there is then there's that very creepy dynamic between him and his widowed sister, Laura Lee Candy Fitzwillie, played here by Laura Coyote. I'm looking at the pause. I'm looking at the thing. I thought I could wing the name, but it completely.
And she's total. I don't remember she looked familiar, and I never looked up her name, but I've never heard of her.
Well, funny enough, it looked like Laura Dern.
Back to the creepy relationship between Candy and his sister. Yeah. It's weird. Everything around Candy is weird. And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Truly. I mean, he kisses her on the lips, I think twice in two different scenes. Calls her an attractive Southern belle. The whole vibe is very strange. Which is why I think Tarantino is trying to build up an archetypal, almost comical version of what we believe a Southerner from that time would be, right? So as I say, just to round it off, that Calvin Candy is really a representation of power in the South.
It made me think a lot about the movie 12 Years a Slave I'm going to say that's kind of in this general, I think it is from about 2012-ish. But so that is a true, of any historical movie that I've ever seen, that pretty much stays straight to the story of, Solomon Northup. That movie stays almost 100% to Solomon Northup's his story, and you can see with the second person, I think it was played by Michael Fassbender.
Yes,
the really strange ecosystem that develops in a closed system where you have a person who is in absolute command of life and death over these groups of people, the slaves, who have zero power, and just the weird dynamic and the something that would not happen in any other group of people, a sociological group. And I think you see that with Candy turned up to 11 again. I mean, in this one, it's turned up to like 100. I think it's also interesting. I think of anybody we see that Candy changed so much during the movie. He's, for most of his time in the film, he's irresponsible. He's silly. And he relies so much on Samuel L. Jackson. Samuel L. Jackson's basically is his brain.
Yeah. So you know what? Maybe I should have added that onto your last comment regarding power and dynamics. Anyone that watched the movie will know right away. It's not Calvin Candy that runs Candyland. It's Stephen Warren, played by. Again, masterfully. We'll use the word masterfully. We'll exhaust its use tonight, I'm sure, with so many phenomenal performances. And you can see that in the not the behind the scenes, but the behind the curtain goings on in Candyland. Basically, whenever Warren is out of Calvin Candy's presence, because you see when he meets Calvin Candy, meets him out front when everyone arrives, he puts on a facade of
subservience.
Of subservience. Yeah. That's a good phrasing. Of subservience. But the second those doors close, he's the man. He has absolute control. And also, speaking on being fake, not a lot of people caught this, but he's shown to be a cripple throughout the movie. Of course, he has the limp, he has the cane. Right towards the very end, he casts the cane away and walks toward Django. So literally, he was trying to just get out of doing any physical work.
Do you get the sense that Stephen and Candy had a legitimate caring for each other? It seemed that way to me.
I would say yes, because when they're at the dinner table and Samuel L. Jackson leans into DiCaprio. Well, let's do the characters. Warren leans into Candy's ear and says, "Meet me in the library." The impression I got was that was a secret, that was a flag on the play type of thing that one has said to the other before. Mm-hmm. And if there wasn't a genuine degree of caring, or at the very least, a understanding that they need the other person, because Calvin would need Stephen to enforce law, and for obvious reasons, Warren would need the influence of Candy. So yeah, I think what it was a buddy call that they've done before. So yes, I do.
Going back to the beginning of the movie, how do Schultz and Django come together? Because I think that scene is key. A lot of stuff kind of happens, and then we get into some more key scenes, kind of in a very Tarantino kind of way, really.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, when we were talking about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, we made the comment that this movie was quite straightforward, and that the big surprise of it was that there were no big surprises. Yeah. And that's completely flipped on its head here. Yeah. So we first meet Calvin Candy. Good grief. We first meet Kane Schultz and Django. Very first scene. Kane is effectively stopping a caravan of slaves, which includes Django, from being transported from one place to the next. And Kane introduces himself and says that he's looking for the Brittle brothers. The Brittle brothers were overseers at the Crucan plantation, which Django was previously at. And there was a bounty on each one of their heads, which Kane Schultz, being a bounty hunter, was after, but he was at a disadvantage because he didn't know what any of them looked like. So that's where he conscripts Django, because Django did know what they look like. And then right from there, the I don't know what you would call them exactly, not slave owners, but the transporters, let's call them, tell Schultz to leave, and Schultz, quick as a whip, shoots one of them, then shoots the horse of the other. And this might be kind of interesting to talk about. Even pays for Django, despite the fact that it's you watch the movie, it's comical. There's no reason for him to have to pay. And then that's how their partnership begins. And then we're along with them for the rest of the movie.
I had a hard time wrapping my head around Schultz as a character because, like you said, in the very beginning, he pays for Django, even though he's killed both of the people, and he wants a bill of sale. He wants it to be completely proper. He kills that sheriff in the town who has a bounty, and that was
not the marshal. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a really calculated risk that he does, but he's completely on the right side of the calculated risk. He could have gotten killed in a heartbeat, I think, and that scene really connects to his final scene, I think.
Yes, and I think in a reverse kind of way. So for the first half of the movie, we effectively see Dr. Schultz shepherding Django through this wilderness, because Django's now newly freed and has a new, let's call it, lease on life. He has guns, he has training, and Kane Schultz is sort of, as I say, shepherding him through this whole thing. By the time they get to, where was it? Mississippi, Chickasaw County, Mississippi. By the time they get to Chickasaw County, it's completely flipped, because now Schultz is completely in the dark, and Django is the one that is showing him, no, I'm intriguing Calvin Candy. This is my world. We have to get dirty, etc. But yeah, thematically, we see it switch then at that point.
I think that scene where Schultz and Django are going to catch a bounty, and the guy's plowing with the son, yes, and Django doesn't want to do it. I think that was Django's major turning point in the film. That was, well, and Schultz even mocks Django slightly, because yeah, in the scene they're propped up on a hill, and the guy at the bottom of the hill is plowing a field, and his son is present there as well. And Jamie Foxx hesitates. Django doesn't want to shoot him, and then Kane Schultz says, "Oh, what happened to Mr. Tough Guy? I want to kill white people for money." And then he explains why they have to do what they do, and the importance of it. And yes, that's I think a major turning point for Django as a character. I think that's when he becomes the super, tough macho guy towards the end. Maybe let's talk a little bit more about how that whole dynamic between Schultz and Django flips towards the end of the movie. Yeah, absolutely. Well, what was interesting was, as you pointed out earlier, Steve, Kane Schultz seems like he's in control of everything, always on the right side of it, but knows what he's doing, and it's very it's always a smart thing to do. Obviously, spoiler alert, he gets shot by Butch in Candyland, and Schultz simply says, "I'm sorry, I couldn't resist." And I took that to mean that he couldn't resist the evil of racism. That's how I interpreted that, because you see in that scene, what flips it for Schultz, where you see in his eyes he's made the decision that he's going to kill Candy, was when DiCaprio, as Calvin Candy, calls him an N-word lover. And you see Schultz has a little smile, and you see it just completely fade from his face. Oh, and not for nothing, I don't think it has any significance beyond just being a clever pun.
But I do want to call the audience to this fun pun that it's Calvin Candy, and then Kane Schultz was a dentist.
I thought about that last scene where Schultz shoots Candy. I think that probably the most of anything in the movie, it just doesn't make sense to me why, in any way, as a literary device or anything, of why shoot Candy at that point when the deal's done. I think in a lot of ways, I think maybe Schultz was somebody who, as a bounty hunter, was in control of life and death the whole time. And I don't think that he really, I think he hated the fact that he got busted in that deal, and that he was the one who was accustomed to putting people in their place. And, he's the one who would, just shoot somebody in the street. And then how Candy, not only just Candy and really Steven, bested him, Schultz, and then Candy really rubbed it in that you have to shake my hand, you have to do this. And I think that Schultz didn't particularly care if everybody got killed, including Django, including Brunhilde. He wanted to end up on top.
So that's interesting. So basically the idea is it was hubris and arrogance that got Kane Schultz in the end. And
maybe it's some of the fact that I think that maybe some of the fact that he really did want to see Candy get killed, because Candy owns Brunhilde. Candy is buying and selling people's lives like they're nothing. And I'm sure that played into it, the hatred. But I really do think that in a lot of ways that was Schultz's way of controlling the situation, and maybe he felt like Django could get himself out of it. I just think, like, as a practical matter, that there was no way that in reality anybody was going to get out of that with that army of I don't know, no employees that Candy had.
Right. Yeah, I agree. That was a bit of a problem that I had as well. I understood from a symbolic standpoint. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist, and attaching meaning behind that. I get that. The thing that I think I just never bought, maybe you can help me out here, is I didn't buy their idea that they couldn't just buy Brunhilde from Candyland. If you recall from the movie, Schultz goes through this whole thing of, let's say a man wants to buy a horse, but the person selling the horse doesn't want to sell the horse. What does he do? He buys the farm. So they, I thought their plan to, let's pretend that we're into Mandingo fighting, and I'm the billfold, you're the eye, and et cetera, et cetera. I just never bought that. I don't know why they couldn't have gone to Candy and said, here's $1,000. It's 3 times what she's worth. I get that it's not as sexy of an ending, but I didn't quite buy it as a plot device, much like we were talking a couple podcasts back about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and that idea of how the would-be killers fix it in their minds and in the minds of the audience that they should go after Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth instead. I just didn't buy it.
I agree that I think that that whole thing was predicated on, and I think they didn't make it clear, is that Candy was never going to meet with them if it was just to buy Brunhilde for a little bit of money, when Candy's making deals of tens of thousands of dollars. He would just never waste his time. And I just don't think that they laid out enough exposition for us to believe that.
I agree. There's one kind of throwaway line where they're in the library and Candy says to Warren, why this whole snake oil pitch about Mandingo fighting then? And then he's basically told, well, you would never pay you'd pay never mind to $300 or whatever it would be. And I think
Candy doesn't believe that.
Right, exactly. Yeah, even Candy is kind of like, well, that doesn't really makes sense. So yeah, I think Tarantino thought he was giving away more than he was with that line. I really think they could have set that up better. I was able to look past it for sure. Suspension of disbelief and all that, right? But
in a lot of ways, the rest of the movie hinges on that. That's the reason why Django can be so brusque with everyone. And even then, I didn't quite follow why Django in this, completely racist society, why Candy is allowing this, because it's ultimately Candy. Walton Goggins' character has a huge problem with it. Everybody has a huge problem with it, but they don't have a say if Candy's fine with it. Right. And they never really they don't explain why Candy's indulging in this behavior.
Actually, I might disagree slightly with that. In that same scene in the library, Samuel L. Jackson says, "But that $12,000 that made you real friendly, didn't it?" Which was the basically the above market value that they were willing to pay for, theoretically willing to pay for a Mandingo. So I think it is. I personally think it is reasonably explained that why Calvin would pay them so much mind, because if I remember correctly, the fighter, he could have sold for, I think it was $9,000, and theoretically Kane Schultz and Django were willing to pay $12,000. So as Samuel L. Jackson says, that made him very friendly very quickly.
And now a brief word from our sponsors, because this is what I thought that maybe they were going to try and, they being Schultz and Django, were going to try and get out of paying the $12,000, kind of do a bait and switch, right, and then pay to free Brunhilde. And the fact that then they had to still pay $12,000 for Brunhilde, like they were offended by that in a way, which, I mean, me personally, I would have paid any amount of money and have been happy about it. I think that in a way they were upset that their switcheroo didn't work.
Yeah, I think that's right. It was a play on the ego, because I'm with you. I mean, because the scene you're referencing is that infamous scene, which I hope we'll talk about at the dinner table. And we there's an 80% chance that they were going to be straight up just shot by Bush. So at that point, just the fact that there was a way out, and all I had to do was pay this money, which I had, by the way.
Yeah, he had it all in a billfold.
Had it all in a billfold. Well, yeah. Well, I was going to say, and just for our audience, I looked it up because this is the movie nerd that I am. So it was $12,000, and it was basically about $120,000 in today's dollars, just to give the audience an idea of the kind of money that we were talking about.
And remember, in the scene where they pay, I think it's Candy, or maybe Steven takes the billfold. It has $12,000. They don't just take everything in the billfold. They take $12,000 and then throw back what's the rest, because they could have very easily stolen everything at that point.
Without question. And yeah, so it's Steven that takes the billfold because DiCaprio has the hammer and is holding Kerry Washington's head. And there was way more than $12,000 in that billfold. So even there's that weird, twisted moral compass that so many of Tarantino's characters have. They'll happily slaughter an entire house of people if it serves their means, but they wouldn't think to not open the door for a woman. Just that sort of thing. I
kind of was waiting for them to say something that somehow with the relationship between Schultz and Django, that maybe Schultz he didn't have an unlimited budget on this thing, that he was maybe only willing, maybe that $12,000 was only what he owed to Django. You know what I mean? For him, this was helping Django out, but it wasn't an unlimited amount of help, that maybe that $12,000 wasn't even really at play. But in the end, he figured that he had to just do it to help out Django.
Yeah, I mean, another way you could phrase it is that's the $12,000 that's for their lives.
Yeah.
Because I mean, there was nothing in the book that said that they could have just been, as I just repeat myself by saying, shot right there. Everyone dies, you know? So, I mean, at that point, if it was me in that scenario, I would have happily paid and I would have smiled.
Let's save the best for last. We'll save the dinner scene, and just maybe kind of go through, because I think for me, when King Schultz kills Candy, that's to me where the movie it didn't fall apart, but that's where any of the realism, and maybe where it really did go into full spaghetti Western, is then it turned into almost the final scene in a video game where all the NPCs are going to kill Django, and Django has one 6-shooter and it gets himself out of it. I thought that was a little it was just it wasn't what I thought it was going to be at that point.
I actually know what you mean. It feels
unsatisfying, maybe you might say.
Unsatisfying, or maybe even it feels like the movie more or less kind of ends, kind of like in Lord of the Rings when they've put the ring in the volcano, but now let's go on for another half hour for no particular reason. I know. Yeah, I know what you mean. Aside from that scene where those travelers again. Let me think. When the people at Candyland sell Django to the LaQuint-Dickey mining people as his punishment, and he hoodwinks the travelers, among them, of course, Quentin Tarantino. That was a good scene. But yeah, it does feel like everything tapers off at once Calvin Candy's shot, and it does go into full spaghetti Western, at least for a few minutes, because it becomes unbelievably violent for however long that gunfight is. The lawyer, Leo Mowbray.
Yeah.
Mogi. Leo Mogi is shot like 5 times in 5 seconds. And yeah, so I see what you mean. I think I agree for the most part. I think that's really the climax of the movie, or by which I mean the highest point of the movie, and then everything after that is sort of cleanup.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think that if they had figured a way to end right after that dinner scene, the movie would have been perfect. Absolutely perfect. And I think, like you said, I think that was a great analogy of for throwing the ring in. The book kind of felt that way too, of Lord of the Rings. It's like, once the ring is gone, what are we doing here?
Yeah, like we get it.
I really don't care that Frodo goes back to his town and it sucks. Like I'm moved past it.
Exactly.
We probably lost the Lord of the Ring fans here, but in a way, that last little bit was just tying up the loose ends. He had to kill Walton Goggins' character. He had to blow up Candyland. But I think just going back to the dinner scene, that was one of the best scenes in any movie I've ever seen.
The DiCaprio's acting in that scene was so good. I could literally smell the cigarette that he was smoking, as far as I'm concerned. And we may as well say the thing that I'm sure all the listeners will be thinking of right now, that when DiCaprio smashes his hand on the glass, and he's so in character, he just goes on with it. I mean, A+ acting. It was when he starts the monologue, "This is the skull of old Ben." I was completely just floored. To think it's the same guy who was in Titanic.
Yeah, or in
Growing Pains. In Growing Pains, yeah, exactly.
It was amazing too, because when you're watching the movie, when you're watching that scene, you get so engrossed, and I'm wondering, why is his hand gushing blood? What is that something I was supposed to have picked up on? And it just added so much to the scene, even though it wasn't purposeful or anything. It was just amazing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also, let's give a shout out to all the supporting actors in that scene. None of them broke character, or at least not in such a way that post-production couldn't fix. Even Kerry Washington, and for the listeners, that was not real blood that Leo wiped on Kerry Washington's face. They did some editing post-production magic, and that was on that. For a start, I think it's probably illegal to wipe your own blood on someone's face. Yeah, I would imagine so.
There's got to be OSHA or something.
But I do know that once Tarantino called cut, I guess everyone in the room gave Leo a standing ovation, and well deserved. Christoph Waltz got nominated and eventually won for Best Supporting Actor for playing King Schultz, and certainly well deserved. He's a phenomenal actor. But man, if there was, it really does seem. It does seem a shame that DiCaprio couldn't get nominated, because that was just a virtuoso performance. I mean, easily one of the top 5 performances he's ever done in a career full of really, really, really amazing performances.
It's just amazing the way it ramped up, where you have that the early part of the dinner where they're just chatting and, talking about this and that, and that famous meme picture of DiCaprio when he's drinking we'll have to use that as the thumbnail of this episode.
Yeah. He looks all cocky.
And he's still the kind of the fool there. And then after that discussion he has with Stephen in the library, he comes in a completely different character. It's just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and seeing him come in with, as I said, the skull of old man, and he talks about phrenology, and he even defines, he points to Django and says, the science of phrenology is crucial to understanding the separation of our two species. Genuinely believing that they're separate species. And he brings up the idea that there's 3 distinct dimples on the skull. In the case of old Ben, it was associated with servility, and that the same would have been the case in Django. Now, this is where it falls apart a little bit, because there's absolutely nothing in Django's behavior, at least at Calvin Candy's scene, that suggests he'd be anything other than, let's call it, confrontational as opposed to servile.
So much of they build up the sensory of the tapping on the skull, and just the whole thing, the way the whole scene looks and feels and hears, it's just unbelievable.
But the tapping on the skull, that hit me, and then also the lighting of the cigarette. He uses one of the candles on the table to light the cigarette, and the cigarette, lights up, obviously. You feel like you're there getting yelled at by DiCaprio.
I guess a good way to wrap this up is, what would you say? I think that to fit this in to all of Tarantino's works, how do you think this movie fits in this specific genre of his later works up to this point, at least, of the historical dramas that he's done, and then some of his earlier works as well?
Well, it's certainly a part of his, I don't know if he was attempting some sort of a recrudescence or a rebirth by tackling this historical fiction stuff. It starts with, I suppose, what our next podcast will be on Inglourious Basterds, and then it's basically run through. You could argue Hateful Eight, but perhaps not. It is a sign of more. There is more complexity to this than in some of his previous movies. You see it attacked a bunch of different ways. I mean, Reservoir Dogs is very simple in its approach, and even Pulp Fiction it's a neo-noir type of movie. I think the genre blending that we so love to talk about really starts actually with Django Unchained. There's that hilarious scene which we haven't talked about of Big Daddy and what looks to be an early representation of an early iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, and there are the bags that they can't see out of because the holes are too small, and it's Willard's wife that made them. And well, if all I had to do was cut a hole in the bag, I could have cut it better than this. And the friend that I went and saw it with, he was hilarious. He said to me that the best part about that scene is that very probably actually happened in real life. So yeah, I would say it's the beginning of a more complex work by Tarantino. And as you point out, the second in effectively 4 movies of historical fiction.
For me, I found just looking at Django Unchained, Hateful Eight, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I felt like a lot of the themes that and the way that Tarantino puts scenes together, it tightened up in Hateful Eight and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Like that scene with the bags and the cutting the eyes out. It was funny, but I felt like it didn't really fit, though. In a lot of ways, I think it took away from the flow of the movie. And I think that there was a couple of scenes in there that could have so easily got cut. But I think that he put them in there. He seems to be big on making that 2 hours and 45 minutes time period. Maybe he did it to flesh it out to that time period, run length. But I just think that could have been probably that whole thing with Don Johnson could have been cut, and the movie wouldn't have been lacking for anything.
They were certainly non-essential. I personally, I completely agree with you there, Steve. It didn't have to be in the movie, but I will say I enjoyed it very much. I'm glad they kept it in.
Yeah, I think maybe a lot of his movies would really lend themselves to the cutting things, having shorts that had like that would have been an incredible short in and of itself. And so I guess in a way it's sort of a short inside of the movie, but it would have, I think it could have done a lot better as its own thing instead of, kind of in the universe of Django. A couple of scenes, like that whole scene, wouldn't you have liked to have seen that the Dickey Mining Company expanded a little bit?
Yes.
It seemed tacked on here, but that seemed like it had a ton of possibilities to make its own thing out of it.
Well, I mean, Samuel L. Jackson gives us a lot of exposition on it. We have a clear picture in our mind of what it is, and just the fact that this guy, just the fact that they want to send him there as opposed to torturing him, tells you something about how cruel it is there. And I would have loved to have seen not a lot, perhaps a half hour, let's say, because we're already at 2 hours something by that point. But I would have loved to have seen it expounded more. If there's one thing I would have preferred to have seen more of, it would have been either that or some of the backstory of Django and Brumhilda. I wouldn't have minded a few more scenes at the Kruken plantation. Plus the legendary Bruce Dern. I mean, you can't go wrong.
That almost would have been a great story, is getting revenge against Bruce Dern. Mm-hmm. And that I think that could have brought a lot of things, a lot of the themes that they brought up in the movie, but having Bruce Dern as the character at the end. I mean, there still might have been a way to bring Leo into that. Leo's his screw up son. I don't know. I mean, I'm not the filmmaker here. I think in a lot of ways, though, that Quentin Tarantino has read our mind if he's going to write more novels and novelizations of the books.
Yeah.
Or of the movies, rather.
Of the movies. And you never know. I personally would love to see Tarantino give it a Once Upon a Time in Hollywood treatment and see a novel or two come out of Django. He drops these sort of expositional clues, like I said, with the Kruken plantation, with the LeQuint Dickey mining people. I mean, there's a whole novel, as you point out, in the Kruken plantation right there. That could be a whole book. And of course, how did they meet? How do they fall in love? Running away, etc.